If you go under view, right, we can see that on the top here we have render, all right, the little teapot. All right, it's also on the very bottom here, all right, of your screen. You'll have the little teapot. Okay, basically that brings up the rendering dialog. Okay, so once we have it set and we're like, all right, we're ready to run a rendering. Okay, kind of the next step that you're going to want to do is set up your rendering settings. Okay, so under engine here, right, what's new in 2016, all right, if you're in 2015 or 2014, you're not going to have this option here, so don't worry about it. All right, but you now have the option within 2016 to choose between the NVIDIA Mental Ray or the Autodesk Ray Tracer. All right, both of which have a little bit different looks. So, if you want to go and do research on either one of them, which one looks better for what types of views, go ahead and you can do that. I'm just going to leave it as NVIDIA Mental Ray. Okay. But under here with quality, all right, this is going to be in both 2015 or 2016 and all the other versions, all right, is you're going to want to set the quality that you're going to run this at, all right? So you can see you have draft, low, medium, high, best, all right, and then custom, all right, as well as edit. So what you're going to want to do with quality, all right, is as this quality goes up, all right, is generally speaking, is, it's going to get more and more accurate with how many times the light is reflecting off of different surfaces and so on and so forth, all right? So obviously the higher the quality setting, all right, is the more clear the image is going to be, and the longer the rendering is going to take. Okay, so for now, because one of the first things you're going to want to do before you go and sit through however long to get this rendering to run, all right, is you're going to want to run a couple of test renderings, right, just to make sure that materials are coming out correctly, right, make sure that you have your lighting set up correctly, right, things of that nature. Okay, so I'm just going to keep it, I'm going to put it at low, all right, because it'll be, somewhat clear, and I don't have a very big building, so it shouldn't take me too long. All right, underneath that, output settings, so resolution, you can either do screen, so whatever resolution your screen's at, it will do your rendering at, or you can set up printer. All right, so if you wanted a specific DPI to go out on your printer, you can select that. All right, obviously, the higher the DPI, you can see the size of the image itself just underneath it, how it's changing. All right, the higher the DPI, the longer this rendering is going to run. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind as well. I'm going to set it to screen for now because for test renders, that works out fine. Okay. Under lighting, right? So now if you use the drop down here for scheme, right, you can see we have exteriors and interiors, right? Sun only, sun and artificial, artificial only, right? So the artificial are basically referring to light fixtures, right? So if you have any sort of light fixtures, all right, you can choose whether it's just the sun, both the sun and lights, or just the lights alone. All right, so a nighttime view, kind of outside, you might just want the artificial ones only. Okay, and you can see you can change it between exterior and interior. So you want to set that up accordingly depending on what kind of view you're looking at. All right, sun setting, if you click on the little button here, okay, you can see we have options here for still, single day, multi-day, lighting. Okay, what's nice with single day, okay, is I had mentioned to you that you have the option of turning on that sun dial, right, that sun position, and actually doing kind of a sun study. All right, what you can do with single day or multi-day, all right, is you can actually set up a date, different times, all right, and how many frames and time intervals, all right. And that way is what Revit will do is it'll do a series of renderings basically from the same view at different times of the day, or in this case, if you select multi-day, they'll do renderings at different times at different days, right? So you can kind of get a study together of how the sun is affecting your building, how the shadows look, and so on and so forth, right? A lot of times it has to do with design, is how the sun's working in with your building, all right? So you're able to do that here within the rendering settings, right? But I'm just going to select still, all right? I just want this one single still shot. All right, you can see you have some presets for summer solstice, winter solstice, things like this, all right? If you click it as in session still, all right, you can select the date, whatever date it is that you're actually doing this, all right? You'll notice location right here, it's set to default, okay? If you remember when I was talking originally, when we were talking about the importance of, going under that manage tab and setting things up ahead of time, this should be set up ahead of time. If you've done that, gone into manage and set your location. If not, you can click on this and do the same thing now, all right? But again, it's going to be important that you set up your location accurately, especially if you're doing a rendering with your sun, all right? Because depending on where you are in the country, all right, or where you are in the world, okay, and also, you know, what time of day it is and what time of year it is, all right, will affect the position of the sun, okay? So you want to make sure that you get it as accurate as possible, right? We can set the date here as well as the time. Okay, now generally speaking, is for times is you kind of have the golden hours, if you will, for rendering. It's generally going to be your hours when you know, you have sunrise, then generally sunset, right? And the reason why those are kind of the best hours to do it is because the sun isn't as direct and as harsh as it would be, right, during the middle of the day. So it's a little bit easier to set your sun settings and get a nice equal rendering across the board, all right, and just kind of get some nice light in there. So I might keep this at 8 p.m. for now. Okay. Again, you can adjust it after the fact as well, all right, and run a different rendering. But this is one of the things that you're going to want to make sure that you set, and then run a test rendering just to see how the sunlight comes out. Okay. And then ground plane, basically just telling Revit where the ground plane actually is so it can project its shadows, all right? So if you happen to be doing something on the roof up here, all right, if you're standing on the roof and looking, you know, at a rendering on the roof, you can change this to roof so that way the shadows project correctly on the roof. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. All right, so that's our lighting. All right, background, as you can see here. Style, you can do sky, right? No clouds, few clouds, very cloudy, right? Anything like that. All right, what you can also do for the background here is set a certain specific color, okay? Which might be nice if you're going to be going and taking this image and photoshopping it anyways. Let's say you're going to put a background in, you're going to take this building and then you're going to kind of plop in a background in Photoshop to give a little more context of what's around it. All right, setting the background to a specific color, right, might be nice because then you can just kind of use that magic wand in Photoshop and, you know, take it out of there easily. But we can also do, that's relatively new in Revit, is select an image. So instead of having to go and Photoshop that background image, right, you have the option of actually selecting the image and placing it in the background. So Revit will go and render it for you. All right, so if you have that set up and you can do it kind of, you know, right here in Revit as opposed to having to jump into Photoshop, you know, you have the option of doing that as well, which is kind of nice. Okay. For haze, set clear or hazy in the skies itself. Okay, and that's it for the background. Image here, all right, is adjust exposure. So for those of you who are familiar with actual photography and using, you know, the exposure settings and everything like that, all right, you may want to come in here and play around with this a little bit. What I recommend is I don't play around with this until after I've done my rendering, because these will adjust a little bit, right, depending on the settings you have and running your rendering. But you can see here that you can change everything from exposure to highlights, midtones, the shadows, all right? So you can really kind of get in and adjust kind of the details of this render itself. And again, I recommend just leaving these as they are until you've actually run your rendering. Okay, so that way you can change it afterwards. Also, too, is, you know, I wouldn't change them after you've run a test rendering. I would only change them after you've done your final rendering. Just because, generally speaking, when you change the quality level from something like a lower draft or low to high or best, all right, is generally the images get a little brighter anyways. Okay, so I would go and make sure that you run the rendering first before you actually play around with the exposure. Okay, and then once we run the rendering, we'll go through save to project and export just after that. All right. So we'll go ahead now, and as I mentioned, is you want to run a test rendering or two first, just to make sure that all your materials are set and everything looks right for you. So we'll hit render. All right, we'll let that process go through. Okay, so my rendering just got done here, and you'll notice that you might not be able to see it much on my screen. I can barely see it as it is, but it basically looks black, right? Which basically means that my sunlight here, a little too late for myself. So what I might do is change it to 7. All right, we'll hit OK. And again, it's a good thing. This is why we do the test renders. All right, to hit render again, kind of make sure that our sun's coming out the way that we want it to. All right, there we go. We get a little bit more this time. Okay, still a little bit dark, so we might want to go through. All right, let's change it a little bit more. Let's say, okay, now it says 7. Let's do 6. All right, run it again. Okay, and so this process of going through, constantly changing the settings, all right, constantly kind of doing, everything we need to get these settings correct, right, the way that we like them, right, is part of the whole test render process, right? So we can see now we have the sun in the background here, okay? And let's say this looks great, awesome, we like it, all right? Is, not only check the lighting, make sure that everything's looking good for the amount of lighting, all right? Check to make sure, let's see, okay, the trees are coming out, the material looks okay, right? Obviously with the settings that we have it on, all right, it's going to be a little grainy, but you want to make sure that it's at least coming out with a material, right? So the concrete showing up, the earth here is showing up, right? My brick here is showing up. Again, it's not going to be very detailed because we're at a low level of quality, right? But we just want to make sure that we're have things showing up, okay? And then, again, just make sure nothing's left out, so that way you don't run this whole rendering and then realize something's left out afterwards, all right? And so the whole idea is that you go through, do a couple test renders, make sure everything's set correctly, all right? And once you're satisfied with it, go ahead and change your quality setting from low to either high or best, all right? Change your output settings, all right, again, from either screen, or if you're going to be printing, as I would recommend choosing a DPI here with a printer, right? 150, 300 DPI, something like that, right? And again, keep in mind is look underneath it here for the width and height of the actual image itself, all right? Because this is going to basically tell you how big this image actually is. So right now, it's 12.5 inches wide, right, by 5 inches tall. So if we think of putting that onto an actual sheet, okay, just think of that, all right? What you can do is, with that size being what it is, right, is once we have kind of our view set here on our camera, right, if we select that outline, all right, which is our camera, and come up to the top here where it says size crop, you can adjust the size of it, okay, by changing the width and the height. All right, now again, the width and the height here are going to be, if you think of it as paper space, all right, so when you print this out on an actual sheet, how wide and how high that image is going to show, okay? Just underneath it, you can see here where it says field of view and it says scale, right? If you have field of view selected and you change the width, right, and you say 12.5 inches, I actually want it to only be, 10 inches, okay? And you hit apply. With field of view, what it's going to do is it's actually going to change the sides of your camera angle. All right, so if you remember, it basically, what we did is it just basically dragged these two edges in, right? So now we can't see as much. All right, so if I change that back instead of 12.5, I'll just change it to 12. All right, so we put that back out. Okay, and the same will go for the height. So if we have field of view selected and we change the width and the height here, it's basically going to change what we're looking at. All right, it's going to scale down and zoom in, if you will, on what we're actually looking at. So it's going to change and move the sides of our view. All right. If instead of doing that, all right, we know this is exactly what we want to show, but 12 by 5 is a little bit large, right? We want to scale it down a little bit so when we print it, it doesn't print out so big, right? If we click on the button underneath here for scale, all right, and you can see here it says lock proportions. If we change this now and say instead of 12 inches wide, we only want this to be 8 inches, all right? You can see once you click over here that it goes and changes the height as well automatically. So now if we hit apply, you see it makes the image a little smaller, but it still keeps the proportions of your view the same, right? So it's still the same view, but what it's done is it's just changed the size that it's actually going to print at, okay? So that's what's nice, and that's what you need to know here about changing that crop region size is field of view and scale, all right? So just make sure you know that when you're changing the size of it around, okay? But so once we have this to a size we want, we've done a few test renderings, we have everything set, right? Again, change your quality settings, make sure your lighting's set up, right? Change your resolution around, and go ahead and click render, right? And that will go and create your kind of final render for yourself.